the one who breaks the darkness with a liberating light. Praise the one who frees the prisoners, turning blindness into sight.
Welcome to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Pastor Steve Andrews. Today we continue with Nehemiah chapter 2. In the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, I took up the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had not been sad in his presence. And the king said to me, "Why is your face sad? Seeing you are not sick, this is nothing but sadness of the heart." Then I was very much afraid. I said to the king, "Let the king live forever. Why should not my face be sad when the city, the place of my father's graves, lies in ruins, and its gates have been destroyed by fire?" Then the king said to me, "What are you requesting?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, and if your servant has found favor in your sight, that you send me to Judah, to the city of my father's graves, that I may rebuild it." And the king said to me, the queen sitting beside him, "How long will you be gone, and when will you return?" So it pleased the king to send me, when I had given him a time. And I said to the king, "If it pleases the king, let letters be given me to the governors of the province beyond the river, that they may let me pass through until I come to Judah. And a letter to Asaph, the keeper of the king's forest, that he may give me timber to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple, and for the wall of the city, and for the house that I shall occupy." And the king granted me what I asked, for the good hand of my God was upon me. Then I came to the governors of the province beyond the river, and gave them the king's letters. Now the king had sent with me officers of the army and horsemen. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant heard this, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of the people of Israel. So I went to Jerusalem and was there 3 days. Then I arose in the night, I and a few men with me, and I told no one what my God had put into my heart to do for Jerusalem. There was no animal with me but the one on which I rode. I went out by night by the valley gate to the dragon spring and to the dung gate, and I inspected the walls of Jerusalem that were broken down, and its gates that had been destroyed by fire. Then I went on to the fountain gate and to the king's pool, but there was no room for the animal that was under me to pass. Then I went up in the night by the valley and inspected the wall, and I turned back and entered the valley gate, and so returned. And the officials did not know where I had gone or what I was doing, and I had not yet told the Jews, the priests, the nobles, the officials, and the rest who were to do the work. Then I said to them, "You see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision." And I told them of the hand of my God that had been upon me for good, and also of the words that the king had spoken to me. And they said, "Let us rise up and build." So they strengthened their hands for the good work. But when Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite servant and Geshem the Arab heard of it, they jeered at us and despised us and said, "What is this thing that you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king?" Then I replied to them, "The God of heaven will make us prosper, and we, his servants, will arise and build, but you have no portion or right or claim in Jerusalem." This is the word of the Lord. So we move on from chapter 1, where Nehemiah has heard the report of the poor condition of Jerusalem from Hanani, his brother. And after what appears to be about 4 months worth of prayer, Nehemiah is in the office of the king. So it's the 20th year still. Nisan is the first month on the Jewish calendar. This could be that their calendars aren't lined up, that perhaps the Persian calendar starts in the middle of the year or later in the year. So the 3-month difference, it's still King Artaxerxes' 20th year. Or it could be that there's also starts in the spring, but just a hair after the Jewish calendar would start with Nisan. Nisan being the first month of the year. But this is, again, still Artaxerxes' 20th year reign. It was the month of Chislev, the 9th month of the year, November, December time, back in chapter 1, verse 1. So 3 months have passed. He's with Artaxerxes, the king, and he's doing his job. He is to serve him wine, and he also as the king's cupbearer, would taste the wine first to make sure it's not been poisoned. So he tastes the wine, he prepares the wine, he serves the wine to the king. And this is what he's doing now. But notice verse 1, I had not been sad in his presence. And that's saying something. It is also, it's an encouragement for us in terms of how we should live our lives. We should live our lives filled with joy and hope, because our neighbors notice those sorts of things. They'll notice that you're always joyful, not happy. I'm not saying live happy all the time. You don't always have to have this beaming smile on your face, but always be filled with the joy of Christ and his coming return, because then they'll notice, and you'll have the opportunity to share with them when they ask you why you're always joyful. Or in Nehemiah's case, if something really does strike you, they'll notice that too, and they'll want to know. And that gives you another chance to share what's happening, to pray, and in some ways to, again, share the faith, the hope that you still have, even though something negative has happened. So for Nehemiah here, he has never been sick before the king. He is serving him well. And the king notices this. The king addresses him. This is probably the case just in general with Persian kings, that you could not address them whenever you wanted to. You had to be addressed by them. We see that with Esther in the book of Esther as she approaches the king, even though he's her husband. She needs his permission in order to even approach. And so that's a similar, perhaps, situation here, and the king does. He extends that opportunity for Nehemiah to speak. Why are you sad? You're not sick. This is sadness of heart. He sees how deeply cut Nehemiah is. And Nehemiah, even at this, still fears punishment. He's afraid at the moment because he is bringing sadness into the king's court. Imagine that, being punished for making the king sad, potentially. So he speaks a word of blessing for the king first, tells him what's going on, that the place of his ancestry, the town of Jerusalem, has been destroyed, and it still is. It's laying there in ruins. The king asks what he wants, and so note what he does here, verse 4. So I prayed to the God of heaven. Right there, in the presence of one of the greatest kings on the earth at the time, asked what he wants. Nehemiah's response is to start with prayer. Now, this may not have been a lengthy prayer. It may not have been an out loud prayer. It may have simply been a very quick and speedy prayer offered to the Lord, saying, Lord, give me the words to speak. And so he speaks. He begins by, again, humbly addressing the king, if it pleases the king. So, I will make my request, but you don't have to do it. I'm not ordering you to do anything. If it pleases you, O Lord, if your servant has found favor in your sight. That hangs him out there, doesn't it? If he hasn't found favor in the king's sight, he's going to be in trouble. But in that case, he wouldn't have been in the king's court any longer already at that point anyway. So, send me to Judah, that I may rebuild. That's the request. I cannot tell you why the mention of the queen is there in verse 6. So, you've got King Artaxerxes and his bride sitting beside him. And the king asks, how long will you be gone? When will you return? That shows that indeed Nehemiah has found favor in the sight of the king. The king likes him, and he wants to send him, but he also wants him to come back. He wants his servant back. So Nehemiah gives him a time, unknown to us, right? Just says, when I had given him a time in verse 6. He doesn't tell us how long, but the king sends him. Nehemiah makes a further request. If it pleases the king, let letters be given me to the governors of the province beyond the river. That would be everything then, the river being the Jordan River. This would be the areas between the Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. Perhaps. I mean, you could look at this from two perspectives. I think that's the way to go. You can look at it the other way, which would be the old Israelite perspective, that it's anything east of the Jordan River. In that sense, it would sound strange to the king of Persia, because he is east. Beyond the river to him is what used to be Israel and Judah. That's why I'm encouraging you to look at it that way. But you could, historically, for Israel, see it the other way as well, in which case these are all the lands that he must pass through in order to get to the river first, and then he can cross the river heading straight for Jerusalem. But if it's looking at the land of Israel and Judah, between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, then what's happening here is Nehemiah is indicating that he already knows that there might be trouble coming, and he's asking the king to grant him letters to the areas that he's going to have to pass through, which is going to include that northern kingdom of Israel. Previously, it's not a kingdom of its own, it's a province. It's governed by, we'll see Sanballat here in just a little bit. So he gets those letters. He also gets a letter to Asaph, the man who keeps the forest, to get the lumber needed to rebuild with. Now, that phrase is interesting, to make beams for the gates of the fortress of the temple. What's being protected? Right? A city wall protects what's inside of it. The noteworthy thing that's inside of it's the temple. It's not to protect the city. It's not to protect the people. It's to protect the temple. That's notable. To protect the house of God from which he will speak his word to his people. The king granted, and Nehemiah has no doubt that God has answered his prayers. The good hand of my God was upon me. So Nehemiah goes, verse 9, he comes to the governors of the provinces beyond the river. He's got some officers with him, some horsemen with him. But Sanballat, the Horonite, Tobiah, the Ammonite servant, and also Geshem, the Arabite, we'll see later on, the Arabian, these oppose him. There's going to be opposition, just like Ezra faced opposition. As Ezra wrote about the opposition that the Israelites faced in rebuilding the temple, so Nehemiah is going to have some too as we go through this book. But first, who are these men? It's hard to say much about them. Sanballat is a Horonite, probably Beth Horon is the reference there. Beth is the Hebrew word for a house, so the house of Horon, which is northwest of Jerusalem. So wouldn't put him too far from where Samaria had been, the old capital of the old empire there. Instead, we don't know where he's living. It's not told to us here. Tobiah, we're not told much about him either. Ammon is a nation that's long been defeated, but not wiped out. Anyway, these two are displeased. They don't want anybody to care for these Jewish people. Now, why? Maybe they fear a loss of power, that when Jerusalem's walls go up, they have less influence over it, or that another governor will be set up, that it will be sort of like a province of its own. Maybe they fear that they're going to lose the ability to take advantage of the Jews. Maybe they're already harassing them and oppressing them and stealing from them, plundering them. Or maybe it's just a sheer hatred for the Jews, the people of God. That's a possibility as well. Hard to say. There's not enough given to us here. Verse 11, so I went to Jerusalem, was there 3 days. So he spends a little time getting to know the layout of the city. It's possible it's his first time there, even though he's got so much ancient history, family-wise, in that land. So he arises in the middle of the night. He ends up being like a spy in his own land as he goes about the different areas, in this gate, out that gate, by this spring, by this place. He's checking out the walls wherever he goes. We don't know what these springs are, the gates are. I mean, these are not names that we are familiar with. So just have the picture in your mind. Think of a city wall that goes around a city, and he's sneaking around at night and examining the walls as best as he can to see what exactly is the status that Hanani has reported to me. And then he returned. He had not yet told any of the Jews what it was that he was supposed to do there. The Jews don't know the king's mission for Nehemiah at this point. I wonder under what pretense they even think he's there for then. Anyway, he admits it in verse 17. You see the trouble we're in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins. Let us rebuild the wall. that we may no longer suffer derision. So the hate of those like Sanballat and whoever else may have despised the Jewish people. Nehemiah tells them about how God has favored him so far on the trip, how the king has spoken well of this, and the people then agree to rebuild. So this is a good direction. Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem all continue to oppose it. They mock them, and they challenge them. What is this thing that you are doing? Are you rebelling against the king? Here's a note to know. Ezra chapter 4, verse 21, Artaxerxes himself had previously declared that the walls of the city of Jerusalem should not be rebuilt unless he himself gave the order sometime in the future to do so. Now he has given the order, but actually I'm going to take a step back. This is what you want to ask your kids. Let your kids answer Sanballat's question. Is Nehemiah rebelling against the king? The answer to that's no. But notice Nehemiah's response and ask your kids about the response. Who does Nehemiah forget to mention in answering that question? So Sanballat wants to know, are you rebelling against the king? Nehemiah then, in response, should mention who? He ought to mention the king. He ought to mention Artaxerxes, but he doesn't. Why? Because he mentions the one true God, the one true king. He mentions Yahweh. He doesn't call him that by name here. He says the God of heaven will make us prosper. Are you rebelling against the king? No, I'm serving the king. I'm serving Yahweh, the God of heaven and earth. That's his response. That's his reply. And because he's serving Yahweh, he knows that his work will be done. It's bold, but it's also true. And it happens to also have the blessing of the earthly king. Not that it would need that, though. If the Lord in heaven wanted it to be done, it would be done. No earthly king would be able to oppose it, successfully, at least. So he then mentions to them that they have no portion, no right, no claim in Jerusalem, which means they have no right, no portion, no claim with the God of Nehemiah, with Yahweh. They are opposing God himself. So this is an opposition that we will see in the days to come as we conclude the book of Nehemiah together.
Let us praise the Word incarnate, Christ who suffered in our place. Jesus died and rose victorious, that we may know God by grace. Let us sing.